Thanks, Mark.
Karen, hey!
All right, hey. Now what? Oh,
How's it going?
Now that we have summoned Dr. Garber.
All right.
So now that Cameron's here, we're gonna jump into the intensity zones. He's kind of
Awesome.
a pro on these, so we wanted him to jump in and join us on this part of the episode.
I wish I was a pro at accomplishing these in my personal training and sticking to them better in my personal training. But yeah, the zones are fascinating, and I talk zones with people all day long. So I do a lot of the VO2 testing. So that metabolic testing, or not necessarily VO2 max testing. If you read the book, it's not necessarily super high on VO2 max testing, nor am I. A maximal test doesn't give you all the information that we necessarily need. We're looking more at how you burn calories along the way, more than what your VO2 max, how much oxygen you can move, is more of a measure of capacity than it is a measure of or potential, I guess. It's more of a measure of your potential than what you're actually capable of performing in a sustained way. So like sprinters often will have a higher VO2 max than an endurance athlete. They're just not necessarily capable of sustaining that high workload for very long. So that's what the zone training though is all about. And so we've got our fancy chart right in the book that we'll post up for you that talks about those zones. Zones are fascinating. Every way that everybody defines those zones is slightly different. What they call the metabolic efficiency point, or the aerobic threshold, is a little bit different than what I consider the aerobic threshold to be. Unfortunately, it's a very poorly defined term in the literature. Every research study kind of defines it slightly differently. And so that's a frustration to those, trying to do research in the field where everything is defined slightly differently. So when you look at a study, you really have to look at how they define the terms. I question the term, I guess, metabolic efficiency. Where we're most efficient is actually where I call that the aerobic threshold, and that's a little bit lower. Where we're most efficient in terms of burning the highest number of fat calories isn't necessarily, or the highest percentage of fat calories. Where we're most technically efficient based on the definition of the term efficient in terms of fat burn isn't necessarily where we're most effective. So I call that the metabolic effectiveness point, or it's typically right around where we're burning 50% fat and 50% carbohydrate. And so in the early chapters, they showed that graph with that crossover point of that metabolic efficiency point, and as you train that aerobic threshold better, that moves further into your heart rate range where that metabolic efficiency point is. To me, I would consider that to be the metabolic effectiveness point, because efficiency, you're actually burning a higher percentage of fat lower in that heart rate range, but that's not very effective. Training there isn't going to kind of give you enough training effect. Your overall calories burned are significantly less. And so that's where I would, I guess, in being nitpicky about terminology. And so I actually consider the aerobic threshold, where we start breathing harder. When you look at a VO2 test, you can see that point pretty clearly. And I don't know, so you could say that there are 3 aerobic thresholds. I don't know. It's all semantics, but it's kind of how I set zones. And so we wind up setting the zones just about the exact same anyway. So anyway, the zone 1 being kind of that low intensity zone where we're just plugging along. It's often more like a recovery zone as much as anything. And they talk about recovery zone is actually 20% less. So being even slower than zone 1, that again, they even mention that when you have too many zones, you run the risk of becoming too specific, and and you make some errors. On that low end, it's hard because, I mean, essentially anything from like 40 beats per minute up to usually like 110 110 or 120. So this huge range could be considered a recovery zone. But basically any activity that you're not putting forth much effort is recovery, but doing something, moving. That aerobic conditioning zone, zone 1, is really important for building up that base, right? For building up the capacity, like they talked about. And that's critical. What's interesting is they said you actually get a better effect training zone 2 once you start getting in better shape. And I totally agree with this. You get a better effect training zone 2, like you get faster results or better results. But there becomes a point at which your zone 2 becomes so fast that there's kind of a law of diminishing returns there, where it may be, even though for your heart and lungs it's fine, may be too much beat up on your muscles, tendons, ligaments. And so in some ways your zone 1 actually starts becoming more of your primary zone, where you're spending more of your time than zone 2. Once you get in within that 10% rule that they talk about, once you get to where your aerobic capacity is meeting kind of your potential, near your lactate threshold, once you get within that 10% rule, you may have to back off of training as much in zone 2 and actually do more of your slow, steady training, your 80% training in that zone 1. Find it fascinating that we've got another person advocating that 80-20 is the best way to go. It doesn't surprise me, but it's always fun to have another like pretty well-respected source say the same thing. Like, that's just what science is showing, and they're proving it on both the field and the lab. And that's great when they can prove it like out on the mountain or on the track or wherever, as well as in the lab.
For sure.
That's always good, because often they contradict one another.
Yeah,
Right.
that zone 2 training, you know, we talked a little bit about how as we continue to progress as an athlete, as we start to get, you know, stronger or faster, that can become too much on your muscles and tendons, despite having a strong enough aerobic system to be able to handle that. Sometimes the actual tissue becomes our limiting factor there. In the book, it recommends that we do, you know, at most 2 to 3 days in that that category, and the rest below that, or a designated hard day where you're up in some of those higher zones as well. And for the most of us, you know, that becomes our pace that we gravitate towards, that zone 2, whether that's a good thing or not.
Right.
A lot of times, you know, you do have to put that conscious effort to be able to either slow yourself down and be able to stay in that zone 1, or really dial it in and be able to, you know, designate each run. You know, you don't want your recovery runs to start to sneak into that zone 2, because then you're diminishing the point of each individual run, because every run should focus on a specific thing and stick towards that one goal. Right,
and that's such a hard thing for people to do, and I can see how it can sometimes rob the fun of just going out and running however you feel like running today. But that's where sometimes we get the fun in seeing the progress rather than in any one day. But when we run slow, I tend to find that I actually enjoy it more, because I'm not so stressed about my pace. I'm not so stressed. I'm just running, keeping my heart rate low, and trying to enjoy the day. But that's tricky to keep it low enough. We tend to, because we can run faster and because we feel good running faster, it's not so taxing as you get more fit, then it becomes easy. And so you don't realize kind of the effect of that running harder can have on other tissues, like you said. So that's the thing. Our cardiovascular tissues adapt much more readily, I think partially because they don't have as much load on them from like a mechanical load standpoint, so that they really adapt quickly, whereas our muscles, tendons, ligaments, joints, bones, some of the mechanical pounding they take, especially depending on what we're doing. If we are climbing or descending hard, or, you know, varied terrain, or, you know, a treadmill run where we take the same step, the exact same step for, you know, 10,000 steps, right? So like when you look at that, when you think about that, where running is kind of a series of movements that you're doing 10,000 of or 5,000 of. If you take 10,000 steps in a day, that means you did 5,000 of the same exercise. I can't remember the last time I did 5,000 sit-ups in a day.
The last time, like, you've done that before?
Yeah, I've come close to never doing that. Yeah. Yeah, no, that it's crazy to think about. Like, you're essentially doing like a hopping calf raise, you know, where you're hopping forward 10,000 times.
Yeah,
that's pretty wild to think about, that you can have the capacity to do that. And so from an other tissue standpoint, a zone 2 training, it becomes fast enough as you get in shape enough that that's really hard on the, I mean, it's all relative. Hopefully your capacity to bear that kind of load has increased as well. Killian's such a great example of that, right? Of somebody that increased their capacity so much that's really not that big of a deal for him, as long as he does it smart, right? But definitely downhill runs, for example. Downhill on single track trail is a really common area for overuse injury, because it requires so much strength and technical ability that it tends to beat us up a little bit more than other types of running. And so yeah, just being aware of that for that zone 2 training, that when we're growing our aerobic capacity, zone 2 is perfect. That's where we grow it. Once we've kind of maxed that out, or getting closer to that max, it starts to become a little bit too taxing to do day in, day out. And like you said, it's a couple days a week. Your recovery runs are a couple days a week, and your speed workouts are a couple of days a week, and typically shorter. Yeah. And so that you're getting that good balance. And those recovery are usually the longest workouts. The zone 2 are long but slightly shorter, and the speed workouts are usually really short. Yeah. So that your total volume of training fits that 80-20, even though they're different days, right? Or sometimes you're doing multiple runs in the same day, like that's what Preston does all the time, right? But one of those may be like a really fast workout, and then the next one is a recovery, and then one's more of a moderate workout, and then the next one's a recovery, so that you're not doing 2 speed workouts in the same day or things like that, so that you can monitor that load.
While we're talking about the zone 1, zone 2, we usually wait till the end to do questions, but one of our viewers had a question about that. They're just wondering, they said, is it better to train mostly in zone 1 or zone 2? They explained to me that their zone 2 has expanded now, and so when they're running at a higher heart rate, their zone 2 goes up to 165 now. So they've been trying to keep all of their 80% low intensity underneath 165, but they're feeling tired, they're feeling beat up.
Yeah.
And so they're curious about how do you know if you should be in zone 1 or if you should be in zone 2?
I think looking at the scope of these zones is important in that, and realizing like the breadth of what they cover. And so when you're looking at zone 2, you know, where that's approaching your aerobic threshold, you're really getting to a point, you know, where you're getting close to, I would say, close to marathon pace at the end of that.
Right.
And so when you're talking about training in zone 2 or zone 1, there is a big difference between, you know, zone 1 where your primary focus is recovery, and zone 2 where your primary focus is almost that utilization adaptation we talked about earlier in this episode. And so the book's recommendation was, you know, once you've become a trained athlete and, you know, this zone 2 becomes something that is going to be very strenuous on your tissues, very strenuous on the health of your body, and then that should be something you do only, you know, 2-3 times a week, and then focusing the rest of it on zone 1. And I think variability is going to be, you know, the biggest thing here, and we talk about that all the time with you know, polar training, and having, you know, 80% be this capacity training where you're really just focusing on getting the mileage and getting the time, developing that red blood cells and your mitochondria density and your capillary density and those kind of things, and then otherwise focusing that last 20% of your training on actually you know, running fast and more the muscular adaptations that are required to be able to become more efficient at running fast.
Right, even just the muscle memory, right, of running faster, just the mechanics of it, for sure. So they did have that guideline of the 10% test, right? That when you can be 10% when you're essentially your aerobic threshold is within 10% of your lactate threshold, that means you're maxing out kind of your aerobic capacity. And so then that's a good time to start doing more zone 1 training, as well as when you can start doing zone 3 training. And I think that's a fascinating concept as we kind of dive into zone 3, right? It's an endurance zone, but it's also kind of no man's land. It's the not really gonna make a lot of progress kind of in the middle of your training, if that makes sense. So as a beginner, you're gonna make really quick progress in zone 3, but then plateau. So you'll get in shape fairly quickly there because you're doing kind of this hybrid of aerobic and anaerobic work. But then you're gonna plateau because you're burning predominantly carbohydrate with a little bit of fat, and you're gonna max out what you can really accomplish there. And trying to run a little bit harder every day, you're just gonna burn yourself up because you're not really building that base to be able to go harder. And that's the problem with zone 3 training. That's why we call it junk miles or no man's land or whatever, is that you're not really building beyond a certain point. And so going from like couch to 5K training in zone 3, you're gonna see some big changes in your overall fitness just because you're doing something for your fitness. So at first you're gonna see some big changes, but then you'll see a big plateau where nothing happens from training in zone 3 after you get to a certain level of fitness. And so it's really a zone to be avoided early on in somebody's training. There's really no major benefit early on. Whereas once you've kind of gotten to where that zone 2 is maxed out and you're doing a lot more zone 1, zone 3 for building endurance and building up your tissue tolerance to that heavier load, that becomes more of, closer to a race pace where you're just kind of pushing it a little bit, things like that, depending on the length of the race, obviously. So like marathon distance, that's more of a race pace, whereas like 100-mile ultra marathon, you're probably not going to be pushing it in zone 3 the whole time, right? So it really depends on length of your contest. But that 10% rule, I think, would be a great, for that question, would be a great tool to use and see like how close to that 10% rule are they. And if they're pretty close, then they definitely want to be doing more zone 1 type training. That's a cool tip that I learned from that. Like I've done that somewhat intuitively of having people train slower, even as they get faster, but never defined it with something that specific, and I love that. So that's fun to have.
That is really cool. So basically, no matter where your zone 2 is at, try to stay at a pace where you can have a comfortable conversation.
Yeah. I think that's a good rule of thumb, and even then, like, so I went on a run with some really fast marathoners the other day, and I was comfortable there, but I definitely, like, from a muscles, even breathing, I was pretty comfortable, but I couldn't hold the same conversation. I mean, they were talking and laughing and joking with one another like it was no big deal. And I was fine, and I could say things, but I wasn't
not comfortably.
Yeah, I wasn't telling jokes, right? And so it was just interesting to see like my capacity versus theirs. Like for them, this was a completely comfortable, easy run. They were just putting in the mileage. Where for me, it was like it was totally a zone 3 run, right? But I wanted to keep up with them and be able to talk and joke and whatever. So, like. But for me, it wasn't an effective run for my overall training, like for my business or for my just wanting to geek out with some really good runners. Like, it was great.
I feel like it's important to have runs like that.
Right, and that's okay to have fun and to enjoy it. And I'm not specifically training for something right now. So like, I think that's fine to do occasionally. But with the understanding that that's probably not doing much for building my base or sport-specific training either, right?
Right.
So understanding that and knowing then that my next run has to be probably more of a zone 1 than a zone 2 to kind of recover from that better is important. So
that makes sense. So that's one thing that I wanted to mention. We were talking about maybe looking at your heart rate makes it not as fun, but I think it's about finding a balance. If you're so obsessed with your heart rate that you're trying to like get this exact number every single time you run and you get obsessed with it, that probably is going to take away a lot of the fun. So learn to find a balance where you're trying to stay within your zone, check your watch occasionally, but also learn to listen to your body and to do what is right for you and how you're feeling, and making sure that you're also enjoying it. So you don't become too obsessed with those numbers in your program.
Yeah, and with many things, I think the more you put in the work to do it early on, the more you can get away from having to obsess over it later on, right? So like Killian mentions that he knows within about 5 beats per minute all the time what his heart rate is, because he's done heart rate training for so long. I mean, he's the ultimate example, right? But the more you do it early on in your training, the more you kind of get that feel of how the way you're feeling corresponds with your heart rate. So you just have to check in occasionally just to make sure that you're still the way you're feeling is accurate, because dehydration and other things can creep up where I still feel fine now, but all of a sudden my heart rate's climbing. Oh, I must be getting dehydrated or whatever. And so they can be helpful cues to fueling or hydrating or whatever, even though you may be feeling fine.
Right.
So
like it's to the point where it's just second nature.
right, yeah, just to check it, just to see like, is the way I'm feeling, does that correspond with the way I'm actually feeling, right? And so it's good. So zone 3, we kind of hit that. Again, it's medium hard, fun, not exhausting. It's kind of that I can do it usually for, depending on how well trained you are, like anywhere from 10 minutes to 90 minutes. Some well-trained athletes can hang out there for that long. That's kind of on the long end of that. But you'll find that sometimes with athletes that are used to suffering. So I find that more with what's the word I'm looking for? The athletes that do the obstacle course races. That's the OCR. Yeah, Spartans and stuff like that. The OCR athletes, they tend to be really good at suffering and staying in that zone 3 for a long period of time. And so they like torturing themselves a little bit. Zone 2 is kind of, from a time standpoint, can be even longer than that, but usually is 90 minutes or shorter. Can be longer depending. As we get more fit, that zone 2 actually probably shrinks in time a little bit. The upper end of zone 2 anyway. The lower end of zone 2 can be next to forever. And zone 1 is basically your forever pace. Like I could sustain this for as long as I want. Zone 4 though becomes pretty short. That's kind of seconds to minutes. And then zone 5 is seconds. And zone 4 is basically, I usually put that right at the anaerobic threshold or lactate threshold, is kind of the bottom of zone 4, top of zone 3, where that's that delineation of like, okay, I've stopped really burning fat effectively. And that's done, it's over, and I'm burning all carbohydrate. And then zone 5 is like peak all out effort. I can only sustain that for like this hill or, you know, a very specific short amount of time. And so great, zone 5 is great for working on like the mechanics of running faster and all out speed, and is a great way to train your body to go harder and faster. Especially the mechanics of that is one thing that I really feel that it's helpful for. It definitely is more of that quick burst, all out effort, where zone 4 is more of like your strides and things like that. Wouldn't you say that that's more of like hard effort, but not like all out maximal as hard as you can go?
Yeah, I think of it as in terms of different race distances when I think of these different zones.
Yeah.
What an all out effort in that race would equate to is the
totally.
primary zone. Because obviously, like in any race, you're using multiple systems at the same time. You're never exclusively, in zone 4 using that lactate threshold or wherever you are. And so zone 4 would kind of equate to like a 400 meter race, an 800 meter race. And then, the 1500, I would say 1500 mile race, you're probably in that zone for a good portion of it, but not the whole time. To be able to maintain a lactate threshold, zone 4 type effort for You know, if you're a really elite miler on the male side anyway, you know, around 4 minutes, that's even a little bit long.
Yeah.
And then thinking of like that zone 5, thinking more like a 100-meter dash, a 200-meter dash, long jump, things that are just like really explosive and really short. And will require like 100% breast to be able to restore that ATP that you're utilizing in that zone 5 training.
Right, and that's an interesting or an important thing to talk about is the different fuel type that you're using there. In zone 5, you're really just using metabolites and not like necessarily breaking down new glycogen or breaking down new fat or whatever. You're kind of using what's stored in the system, and so whatever's available. And so it takes some time to recover some of that. So the ATP and some of those other kind of metabolites that get stored for that quick burst, it can take a bit to recover depending on how hard you're working out. So if you were doing like a zone 3 run, you're going to have less capacity to do those bursts of energy versus a zone 2 or zone 1 run. You'd have a lot more capacity to burst up because your body's going to be able to recover some of those stored you know, forms of quick energy. Yeah.
Previous coaches I had kind of related that to like a typical football play. And then, you know, it's just this short burst of energy and then complete rest. They go and they run one play and then they huddle up and rest. And that's a lot of the reason for that, because football is very much so very explosive, very fast-paced type sport.
Right. No, I've heard that said before. Like, if you want to train for football, don't go out and run 3 miles every day. Right. Like, instead, go out and run maybe for the same amount of time, but run a bunch of sprints where you stop and start and stop and start, and you build up your endurance for those quick bursts of energy. Like, how many quick bursts of energy can I get in instead of like how long can I run for at a fast pace, right? So it's a different way of training altogether.
Yeah, in the book, there is like an upper limit of how much that you do want to do of those short bursts, those sprints. It relates it back to saying that when you get to the point where you feel like your performance is dropping in those short sprints because of either muscle fatigue or other underlying factors, that's the point where your workout should be done. Because at that point you've hit your goal, you've pushed the upper limits of that zone 5, and once you get below that, you're kind of starting to get into that garbage training that we kind of mentioned earlier.
Where you're not really accomplishing anything, right? It's I guess that's not 100% true, because you may be developing mental toughness and other things like that, but you're not developing physiologically what you need to develop, and so it kind of is wasted effort in terms of physiological development. Now, cognitive development or toughness or whatever, I think it's just as mentally tough sometimes though to stick to a plan as it is to push yourself a little bit harder in a run. Like, sometimes that's easier to push yourself a little bit harder in a run because we enjoy that than it is to be like, nope, I guess I am done today. Like, mentally, that's really tough. To be like, I had planned to do this, or it says on my paper that I should do this, and then I'm gonna cut it off because for whatever reason I'm not feeling it, or the metrics aren't working out to where that seems like the best thing to do for my body. That, I think, builds as much mental toughness as anything to like stick to the way I'm feeling and whatever, instead of what it says on the paper that I should do today.
Yeah, that comes back to kind of our question from our viewer, you know, talking about that zone 1, zone 2, and it does take that mental strength to be able to differentiate that and really be hard enough on yourself that you are disciplined to be able to stay in the right zone, and when you are unable to do that, calling it quits and being like, okay, it's a good workout, I'm done for today, let's recover.
And I think a lot of that just comes from, we just need to learn to not care what other people think and trust ourselves and trust our instincts, and then maybe also trying to help create this community of respecting everyone's workouts.
I have definitely changed. When I see somebody running down the road, I've definitely changed kind of the way I think about it, for sure. At one point in time, I used to think, oh man, she's not even burning any calories, she's just walking down the road, or that guy, like, he's going so slow, how could he be doing anything at all? And now I'm like, all right, he's going slow.
Good for you for walking.
Nice work. Way to be, you know, like putting in the time, doing something rather than nothing. And, you know, you're actually doing more for yourself than you think, even though you're envious of the guy that just jogged past you, who, like, I don't know, may not be doing as much for where he's at as you are for where you're at. And so, yeah.
Yeah. Do you know what I did in high school? This was so bad.
Wow.
Anytime me and my siblings all did track together, and anytime we saw someone walking on the road, we'd roll down the window and be like, "Run! Stop walking! Run!"
Right. But isn't that funny though? But that's kind of the mentality we grow up with in sports, right? That if you're not, I honestly used to think that if I didn't like puke at the end of a workout, that I wasn't pushing myself. Like if I didn't feel like I was going to puke, I don't know how many times I actually puked, but there were a few. But yeah, I felt like if I wasn't really pushing myself hard, I wasn't really accomplishing much, or that I could have given more. And now I realize like that's not really the case. That there are times in which you push yourself hard, but it doesn't need to be every workout, and that any effort is better than no effort, even if it's a half effort or whatever. Like you still got out there, you still burned more calories, you still did more work, you still put more load on your tissues, you know, so doing something is always better than nothing, because it still made your body have to adapt in some way, shape, or form. Whereas sitting on the couch did not. So
it was one of the athlete stories. He said that his goal was to run every single day, and he said that he had to at least run to the end of his driveway.
Yeah.
And he said that that's literally all he did, and he was done for the day. So
I agree with that.
Just do something. Yeah.
Just something. It can be just a walk around the block, right? It doesn't have to be monumental. But that 10 minutes of walking around the block is more effective. So when I first started getting into zone training and the whole 80-20, this was a long time ago, back in the dark ages. The kind of the theory that we were using was actually more of a 70-30, but I was busy in school. I had 3 kids. No, 2 and 1 on the way, and all this stuff. And I found that I just started with walking around the building. So it was this building actually where we're at recording now. I'd go and take a lap around the grocery store, sometimes 2, and just go walk for like 20-30 minutes. Grocery store in the building and kind of this area, I'd go walk laps, and yeah, that was it at first. It was just a walk. And because that's where my zone was just in a walking pace, and I could not believe that was going to do anything for me. And I lost like 20 pounds in 8 weeks. It was crazy.
Oh, that's awesome.
And like, yeah, started feeling better and actually started running again. And so that was the beginning of me starting to like dabble with trail running and whatever. So kind of interesting, but it started out with just walking. And so now I have so much respect for even just putting in the time and working on consistency first. So that's one of the things that I missed that earlier part of the conversation about the capacity versus utilization. Really the capacity, the key there of the zone 1 and 2 training is just the consistency of it. You have to build the battery bigger, you just have to be consistent enough that you're making your body make that change to be able to handle that consistent loading on your body, so that it can build up and strengthen everything that needs to be strengthened. It's not just heart and lungs. There's so much more to it. And so, yeah, I think that principle of building the capacity by starting where you're at and building incrementally from there is the key.
Exactly. Consistency is key.
Yep, big time.
Well, how about
Awesome.
we wrap up here? We do have one more question that somebody submitted.
Okay.
It's more the latter half of the book, but we told them that we'd answer it today.
Yeah.
We told them that we were going to read all of chapter 3. Anyways, their question is, how do I become fat adapted, but also eat right to recover right? Because in the book, he talks about the importance of eating 30 minutes to an hour after workout, but he also talks about becoming fat adapted and suggests see how long you can go without eating. So where do you find the balance there?
It's a good question. So fat adapted is a really loaded topic and issue, because like carbohydrates also really matter in training and stuff. So the concept of like having some carbohydrate that's going to somehow throw you out of burning fat isn't exactly accurate. And the eating within 30 minutes of training, I hesitate to always think that elite athlete nutrition and Joe Blow on the street nutrition are the same, right? Just because that's what they recommend for an elite athlete doesn't necessarily mean that's what we need to do, because we're not like those elite athletes. The reason why 30 minutes after your workout to eat is because they're probably going on another run tonight, and the speed with which they recover is critical. Whereas I'm probably not going on another run till tomorrow or the next day, and so like it's going to be fine. I'll have enough time to recover and get those calories where they need to be by the next run. And so I don't know that that's as critical unless our volume really starts to pick up. Like when we're training at higher volumes and training at higher frequency and intensity, then that stuff starts to matter a little bit more. So it really depends on kind of where you're at in your training. But like increasing protein load or increasing, you know, or focusing more on the timing of our food really doesn't matter until we start training at higher volumes and higher loads beyond just that of a recreational runner. But if you're just going for like an hour a day, you know, 3 to 5 days a week, your nutrient timing doesn't matter so much. Your, you know, those types of things don't matter quite as much. When you start training for multiple hours every day, when you start getting in, you know, like 10 hours a week of training, then it really starts to matter. That's a lot of training, right? But if you're 3 to 5 hours worth, you're probably going to be fine not focusing too heavily on that.
Well, you start to become fat adapted in different ways when your volume's higher.
Yeah.
Because when you are doing those second runs every day, those runs, your primary fuel source is going to be fat.
Yeah, depending on how hard you go, but usually it's a slower run, and that second run is actually typically a little bit higher percentage of fat.
Yeah, well, you see that in the lab too when we're testing people's respiratory exchange ratios, their RERs, that typically those numbers will lie, if it's just like an everyday run, like you said, like if you're going hard, of course it's going to be higher on the spectrum towards carbohydrates, but generally those numbers are a lot closer to that 0.7, that number that is saying that you're burning 100% fat.
Right, yeah, on the second run.
Yep.
Yeah, it's awesome. So that's part of why they do the second run in a day.
Yeah.
Is it really does help you train to burn fat. So fat adaptation that's a tricky thing, but you're not necessarily like, oh no, I had some potatoes in with my whatever, like now I'm no longer burning fat. It doesn't exactly work that way. Does your body have to process that carbohydrate as it comes in? Yes, for sure, but you can still be mostly fat adapted, and you can also really work on the quality of calories. I think matters, the speed with which they digest and stuff like that. So eating some high carbohydrate food but that are slower to digest because they're a more whole grain or whole food source of carbohydrate, I think that helps a lot to allowing your body to process the carbohydrate more slowly as it comes in, as your body breaks it down and digests it, versus like this huge bolus when I have like a Gatorade, right? Which is like, sugar, right? So much sugar. And so now your body's like, well, what do I do with all this excess sugar? I can't use it all right now. Well, let's release some insulin to trigger the cells to uptake that and store it as fat, right? So will a lot of that be uptaken and stored in the muscles and things like that? Yes, but there's usually in like a sports drink more than we really need, and so now there's excess, and it cues that more often than not to store it as fat or to void it. And so yeah, that may be overkill for some people. Anyway.
Thank you guys, you put that very well.
I guess.
Yeah.
I can ramble on all day about this kind of stuff.
So much to talk about.
Yeah. Oh,
Sure.
so many things. I mean, this for me brings up just so many different things that I talk with people all day as we test them in the lab. We wind up testing them and explaining like why their results are different from their spouses or their friends. Like, it's always interesting when two people come in and test. So I had them today where two different people came in and tested at the same time. and why their numbers and results were so different, even though they were basically doing the same things in their life right now. Like, how could it be so different? And it's
No,
like,
I walked in when the girl had already done her resting test, and the guy was just finishing his resting
Oh,
test,
yeah.
and she's like, "Oh, so you just get to sit around and eat way more than I do."
yeah, like, well, he's a bigger guy than she is, you know, like it has to match the so many factors that play into it. Genetics, training level, muscle densities, muscle fiber types. That's something we didn't really dive into with the different zones, but how muscle fiber types play into that. You know, more slow twitch fibers are engaged in zones 1, 2, and part of 3 starts becoming more of a hybrid, and how that plays into the whole thing of what types of fuel that those muscle fiber types tend to use. And so, yeah, that's a whole nother rabbit hole we could go jump down. But
And we'll dive deeper into those things as we
Yeah.
continue to do this podcast.
for sure. So yeah, it's fun stuff. We can really geek out about it anytime, but
For sure. Well, we'll wrap it up here. Thanks, Cameron, for joining us on this episode,
it's
and
fun.
hopefully you can join us for some more episodes. We're going to do a quick shout out to our sponsors. So, quick shout out to the Ogre to Stansbury Trail Series, or the Trail Series in Tooele by Jimmy Thomas. Shout out to the Utah Running Shop, and shout out to the Wasatch Run Club.
Yeah, check out the Wasatch Run Club on Facebook or at wasatchrunclub.com. We meet every Wednesday to run. Pretty awesome group.
yeah.
Lots of fun.
Cool. Don't forget to drop any comments, questions, things that you have in the comments down below. We would love to respond to them, or things for the next episode, for sure.
Perfect. And next time we're going to go through pages 96 to 119, and we'll catch you guys next Monday morning.
All right.